Hello everyone. Let us now revise second unit, that is functions. A function is a reusable block of code which is designed to perform a specific task. Functions allow us to write cleaner code, modular code and maintainable code by encapsulating logic into reusable units. These are some key characteristics of functions. Function provides encapsulation by promoting modularity. Once defined, function can be called multiple times, which provides us reusability by reducing redundancy. Function can simplify complex operations by hiding their implementation details and provides abstraction. And functions can accept any number of inputs, that is parameters, and return outputs. While defining functions, we give parameters, and while calling the functions, we pass arguments. So arguments are actual values that we pass at the time of function call, and parameters are the variables we define in function definition. Function can also return outputs by using return statement. If no return statement is specified in JavaScript, function will return undefined. In this way, function provides us flexibility because inputs are also optional and return statement is also optional. If we need to give some parameters, then we can specify it, otherwise we can avoid it. And if you want to return any result from the function, then only specify return statement, otherwise you can skip the return statement. In JavaScript, there are multiple ways of defining function. First is function declaration, second is function expression. This is also called as anonymous function, and the third way to define function is arrow function. Let us go through them one by one. First and foremost, function declaration. Function declaration is a regular way of defining function using function keyword. This is most common method for creating functions. Syntax of function declaration is function keyword followed by function name. Then in parentheses you can specify parameters if required, and then in curly braces you can write code that you want to execute on function call, and then at the end you can give return value, which is again optional. If you don't return any value, by default JavaScript will return undefined. Let us see some key points about function declaration. Function declarations are always name function. That means we always specify name to the function. Second point is about hoisting. Function declarations are hoisted. That means they can be called before their definition in the code. And function declarations are always in global scope. They can be accessed anywhere in the code. But if you are defining nested function, that is function within another function, they are scoped locally. So this is all about function declaration. Let us understand function expression. Function expression is when function is assigned to a variable or constant. When we assign function definition to a variable, it is called as function expression. They are usually anonymous, that is, they do not have name. They are not hoisted, so you cannot call them before their definition. They are usually anonymous, but name can be provided if required. Function expressions are very convenient when passing a function as an argument to another function. Function expression can be assigned to variables. They can be passed as arguments or returned from other functions. Here you can see syntax of function expression. We have defined a variable here using const, and to this variable we have assigned one function. So this is called as function expression. Here we have not given any name to the function, that is why this function is also called as anonymous function. But you can also specify name, as you can see in this example. After function keyword we have given name to the function, but it is optional. Such function expression can be passed as argument, or you can return it from some other function. We have seen two methods of defining function in JavaScript, declaration and expression. Let us understand what is difference between them. First point of difference is function declarations are hoisted, so they can be called before their definition. Unlike function declaration, function expressions are not hoisted, so they cannot be called before their assignment. Second difference, function declaration must have a name, whereas name is optional in function expression. You can specify or you can skip the name in function expression. Usually they are assigned to variables. So if you want to call function expression, we use the variable to call it. Function declarations are used for defining reusable, standalone functions, whereas function expressions are used in dynamic contexts like callback. That means if you want to pass function as a parameter, or closure if you want to return function from some other function. In this way, function declarations are less flexible and used for static definition, whereas function expressions are more flexible and can be dynamically created or assigned. Here, one example of function declaration and function expression is given. So both functions are same. Here we have used declaration method. So function followed by function name, then in parentheses specify the parameters, and then function body. This function we have to call using this function name. So you can see here we have called this function using function name and we have passed the parameter. Similarly, if you want to create a function expression, first we have to define a variable, then assign, so assignment operator, and then define a function. Here we have not given any name, directly given parameters to the function followed by function body. Now how to call this function? By using this variable. So here you can see we have used that variable getRectArea to call the function and we have passed the parameters. Many times this question is asked in exam to differentiate between declaration and expression. Let us move further. The next topic is default parameters. In JavaScript, default parameters allow you to set default value for function parameters. That means if an argument is not provided, the default value will be used instead of that argument. Default parameters were introduced in ECMAScript 6 and provide more concise and readable way to handle default values. One rule for default value is the default parameter must come after non-default parameters. So while defining function, you can have mix of default and non-default parameter. In such cases, first you define all non-default parameters followed by default parameter. Here is the example of default parameter. We have defined a function. The name of function is multiply. This multiply function has two parameters, a and b. A is non-default parameter whereas b is default parameter because we have assigned some value to it. This function will simply return multiplication of a and b. When you call this function, you will see the difference. In first call, we have passed both the parameters 5, 2. So in this case, value of b will be 2. So this default parameter b will be overwritten. Now in second call, we have passed only one parameter. So this value 5 will be assigned to a and for b it will take 1. So the result is 5. Now third call is little bit tricky. Here we have passed two parameters but the second parameter is undefined. So if you are passing undefined as a parameter, the default value will be considered for that parameter. So here b will be considered as 1 and output will be 5. Default parameter is also one important concept in functions. Next, let us understand an interesting concept of arguments object. Argument object is a special array-like object available within all non-arrow function. Please remember, argument object you can use only in non-arrow functions. What is argument object? It contains all arguments passed to the function. and you can allow all the arguments using that object even if you don't explicitly define parameters in the function declaration. Here are some properties of argument object. It is array like. That means it is not true array, but it can use length property of array and can be accessed using indices. But it is not true array because it does not. Second important property of argument object is you can use it only in non-arrow functions, only available in regular functions, not in arrow function. It includes all arguments passed to the function even if they are more or fewer than defined parameters. So if you have defined one function with two parameters and at the time of calling you are passing three parameters, all three parameters you can access using arguments object. Let us check one example of arguments object. Here we have defined one function with three parameters, and these parameters we are accessing using arguments objects. So arguments of 0 will give you value of A, arguments of 1 will give you value of B, and arguments of 2 will give you value of C. So if I am calling function with these three arguments, it will print 1, 2 and 3. You can also use length property. Instead of accessing one by one argument using index, you can directly use for loop, and for loop will iterate from 0 to arguments dot length minus 1, and then we can use arguments of I to print the arguments. This is about arguments object. Arguments object have some restrictions. To overcome that, we have one more interesting concept, that is rest parameter. Let us see rest parameter. In JavaScript, rest parameter allow you to represent an indefinite number of arguments as an array. Rest parameters are particularly useful when you don't know beforehand how many arguments will be passed to a function. To specify rest parameter, we have a syntax, that is three dots. In this example, you can see we have a function sum. For this function, we don't know how many parameters would be there. So we have given only one parameter with three dots. This is rest parameter. Once you specify rest parameters, at the time of function calling, you can pass as many arguments as you want to the function. And inside this function, we have first assigned 0 to the total. This function will basically calculate sum of all the arguments. So we have assigned 0 to the total, and then using for loop we are iterating over all the arguments passed. So in function call, if I am passing 3 arguments, it will return sum of these 3 arguments. If I am passing 4 arguments, this function will return sum of these 4 arguments. Likewise, if I pass any number of arguments, it will give me sum of all the arguments that I passed. Few things we should always remember about rest parameter. In a function definition, it can only have one rest parameter, because with one rest parameter we can specify any number of arguments. So one rest parameter is sufficient for a function, and rest parameter must be the last parameter in function definition. From this we can understand that one function can have mix of regular parameters and a rest parameter. But when you specify such parameters, rest parameter should appear at the end. So these two are the wrong definitions of function, because in this definition we have passed two rest parameters which is not required and not allowed, and in this second definition we have passed rest parameter as first argument which is not allowed, because in this definition rest parameter is specified in the beginning. Instead, it should be specified at the end of this function definition. Rest parameter and arguments objects are again important topics from exam point of view. Programs can also be asked based on rest parameters and arguments object. Now let us see arrow functions. Arrow functions are introduced in ECMAScript 6 and which simply provide a shorter syntax for writing function expression. They offer a more concise way to write a function. Arrow functions don't have their own bindings to these arguments and super. We have also seen this point in arguments object, that arguments object is allowed only to non-arrow functions. So inside arrow function you cannot use arguments object. Arrow function provide a more concise syntax by omitting curly braces if there is only one statement, and we can also omit return keyword if function body contain only one expression. Parentheses to the parameters can also be omitted if function has single parameter, but if function has multiple parameters, no parameters, default, destructured or rest parameter parentheses are required. Let us see some examples of arrow function. Here we have defined one function called grid. Grid function has no parameters, so we have given empty parenthesis followed by arrow and then only one statement, that is hello world. So if your function has only one statement, by default it will be returned. So this hello world will be written when you call grid. So if I say console.log grid, this will print hello world on the console. Now let us check the second example. Here we have a single parameter. So our function name is square. Then we have a single parameter x. So no parenthesis given, and then simply arrow and x star x. So this function with single parameter will return square of that number. So if I call square 4, it will return 16. You can see arrow functions are making our function syntax very concise. We have not given curly braces, we have not given parentheses, even we are not using function keyword. Simply one liner function we have written and it is doing expected task. Now let us check some more examples. Here we have defined add function with two parameters. So if more than one parameters are there, parentheses are required, but only one statement is there, so no return a keyword required. This function will return addition of two numbers. Now this is multi-line function body. So if we have multi-line function body, curly braces are also required and return statement will also required. So here sum function with two parameters. So parentheses are given followed by arrow. Then in curly braces we have given function body where we calculated a plus b and then return that result. So multi-line function body, multiple statements are there, so curly braces are also required and return statement is also required. We can call the function using this variable name, pass the parameters, this will output 5. Arrow functions are also important from exam point of view. Next we are going to see recursive functions. Recursive functions are functions that calls itself. This technique is used to solve problems that can be broken down into smaller and similar subproblems. Recursion is a very common method for solving problems that involve repetitive tasks or complex data structures like trees or graphs. Recursive function has two parts. One is a base case which will ends the recursion, and another is recursive case which will repeatedly call and resumes the recursion. Let us see one example of recursion. This is recursive function to print nth term in the Fibonacci series. So here our base case is if n equal to 0 or 1 will directly return n, that is 0 or 1, but if n is greater than 1 we have to call same function with addition of previous two terms. This is called as recursion. These are some best practices for function design. So whenever defining function, keep the function small and focused. Designate a function to do one thing and do it well. Use default parameters whenever appropriate. Usually instead of printing messages from the function, the better way to return values from the function and then use those values in further processing. Use arrow functions for short callbacks. Use recursion carefully. handle base case to avoid infinite recursion. Functions are designed for reusability, so don't duplicate the functionality, instead reuse the functions. Now let us check some important programs from this unit. The first program is to create a function named calculate average that uses rest parameter to calculate average of all numerical arguments. In example of rest parameters, we have seen how to calculate sum of all the arguments. Here we just have to calculate average. So let us define a function calculate average. Here we are using function declaration. We have to use rest parameter. So here I have specified one parameter with 3 dots. Inside function, check if no parameter is specified, that means if numbers.length equal to 0, then return 0 as average. Otherwise, initialize one variable sum with 0. We can iterate over rest parameter using for loop. So here we have used for loop. Let num of numbers is our rest parameters, and using for loop we are iterating over numbers. So in num we will get one by one value from that array, and we are adding this num every time to sum to get the sum of all the arguments. After for loop, let us calculate the average. So average can be calculated using sum divided by length of numbers. So sum divided by numbers dot length will give you average, and then return average from the function. Now to use the function, we'll just call the function with variable number of arguments. So here we have passed 3 arguments. This function will give you average as 20. If I pass 2 parameters, average of these 2 numbers will be calculated as 10. And if I am not passing any argument here, this will return 0. So in this way, we have written a function using rest parameter to calculate average of all the arguments. Similar program we can do using arguments object. Instead of rest parameter, we can use arguments object and calculate average. So the second program is similar to first one, only the change is using arguments object. So here we have not given any parameter to the function, but inside the function we are using arguments object directly. So here we have checked if arguments.length equal to 0, then return 0. That means if no arguments are passed, we'll directly return 0. Otherwise, we are doing the same thing, initialize sum with 0, iterate over all the arguments using arguments object, and then in every iteration add arguments of I to the sum. This will give you sum of all the numbers. After this for loop, let us calculate the average using sum divided by arguments dot length and then return the average. There is no change in calling the function. We are calling function with variable number of arguments, and the output will vary accordingly. Next program is using default parameter. So here we have to define a function to multiply two numbers where second parameter default to 1. So we have to define a function multiply with two parameters a and b. Second parameter is having default value 1. So if we don't specify second argument, it will automatically take 1 as its value. From this function we just have to return multiplication of those two numbers, and then we can check its functionality by calling the function. So here we have called function with two arguments. So this default value will be replaced with 3 and it will give you output as 15. In second call we have passed only one parameter. So default parameter will be used. So 7 star 1, that is 7, will be written. Next program is again using default value to calculate price of an item by applying tax. So this calculate total function has two parameters, price and tax rate. Tax rate is having default value 0.05. Inside function we are calculating price. First we have calculated tax amount equal to price star tax rate, price multiplied by tax rate, and then we are adding that tax amount to the price and return total from this function. And after that function we are calling the function with one parameter. So this, in this case, it will take default tax rate at 0.05 and will output 105. If you pass second argument, it will override the default value and calculate the tax rate according to this value and will output 220. In this program, we have passed array of numbers as a parameter and we want function to return maximum number from the array. So let us define a function. Name of function is find max number. We are passing one parameter here. Inside function, let us assign first value from that array to max, and then we will iterate over the array and we will check and will compare one by one value from array with max. If we found some value which is greater than max, we will reassign max with that updated value, and when we'll reach till end of array, we will get maximum number from the array. That maximum number will be returned from the function. Then we are calling the function and we have passed here array and we'll get output as 99. But if I pass empty array, the output will be null because there are no numbers in the array. Max will be assigned with null and it will be returned. These are some important questions from Unit 2. Thanks for watching.